All right, we will get started. Hope everybody got cookies, coffee, water, whatever. So, I am speaking tonight. Brigette has been very encouraging to me and said I will do a good job. So, I'm going to take that and move with it. So it's kind of funny, and I say this every time I speak, like, I'm told that, hey, can you speak? And they usually give me like a couple weeks, or like 3 weeks or 4 weeks, or something like that. Give me an idea of what I'm speaking on, and I'll have an idea in my head, and I'll be like, this is what I'm going to speak on. And then as I get closer to that date, I throw out those ideas, and because I'm going to do this now, and then as it gets closer to, the hour, then I start throwing out other ideas, and because I'm going to go this route. So by the time I get here, I feel like unprepared and stressed out, and my ideas just feel like they're not going to congeal, they're not going to make any sense. And this is how I've done it so far every time. I think I've spoken here this is my 4th time or something like that. And so this is just kind of how I operate, I realize, and it is what it is. It's kind of funny though, because one of the times I had spoken here at church, and I just want to see how good a camera person is going to be tonight. I spoke at church, and my oldest son Jack had been talking to somebody. He was at school or something like that, and he was telling somebody, like in his mind, he kind of like thought of what I did here in this sense. He said, yeah, my dad sometimes is a substitute pastor at our church. Because the only concept he had for somebody standing in for somebody else was a substitute teacher. And I thought that's actually like a pretty good title for what I do. Like, because we've all had substitutes, and they're usually all kind of the same. 1, they have no idea what they're talking about until they get there. And 2, they have no idea what's going on. And that's kind of like how I approach things here. So, substitute pastor, that's a great title for me. So, a couple weeks ago at dinner, I was thinking something along these lines, and I asked the family, we all sat down, we're having dinner, and I said, what is faith? Like, what is it? We talk about having faith, we talk about practicing our faith, we talk about all these things with faith. But do we know, like, what it is? Do we have something to be like, yeah, that's faith right there? And it's not as easy an answer as you think. There's a lot of complexity involved in faith. And so this kind of got me thinking, asking questions at the dinner table. I asked the boys, I was like, so what is faith? Would you say faith is, and I'll ask you guys here tonight, do you think faith is like going to church? Is that faith? Are you a Christian just because you go to church? No, we kind of know that, right? But that doesn't mean that church is unimportant toward faith. Like, that's an aspect of faith, but it is not the thing itself, right? So, we're not here to denigrate church or anything like that. That is not what faith is if we define it. So, what else would it be? I mean, we all are here hopefully practicing it at some point. Some people want to say, like, faith would be like believing the right things. Right? Now, I don't want to put that down either, because we do have certain beliefs that we hold that are important to our faith, but those things are also not the faith per se. And we'll get to a part here that talks about it. But just hold on to that. So, not putting down beliefs in certain things or facts. The facts are not the thing that gives us the faith that we practice every day. So what is faith? Well, I was trying to think, like, where should I pull from? The Bible talks about faith a lot. Ironically, actually, the Bible doesn't talk necessarily so much about faith, but it already kind of assumes it in a lot of cases. It doesn't really always spell it out for you, like faith is such and such. And yet, we practice it all the time. We're practicing it now. Hopefully, we practice it every day, and it's something that is a part of who we are. And so, for me, there are multiple areas that you can go in the Bible and read what Paul, for instance, has to say on faith, or read what Jesus has to say on faith, or hit the Old Testament and understand how the prophets understand faith or whatever. And I have decided to choose the book of James. Now, what's interesting about James is it's a very frustrating book. It's one of my favorite books of the Bible. It's only got 4 chapters, so you could read it in one sitting. So you could just, like tonight, if you get home, pull out your Bible and read the 4 chapters of James. And what I like about James is it kind of reveals, in a sense, the messiness of how we practice our faith. It for one thing, James makes some statements that almost seem to be countering what Paul is saying, say in Romans or whatever. And I think that helps us. And I'll get into that as I move on. So I'm basically just going to read the first 2 chapters of the book of James. And I think I'm going to read it once all the way through, and then I'll go back and I'll do a little commentary on it as we work through. Does that sound fair? So listen for a chunk, and then we'll go back and we'll discuss it a little bit. So James, the book of James, it's named after the author, James. There's like 3 or 4 different authors that we can think of that would go by, or that went by the name James. There was James the Just, and there was James, the half-brother of Jesus Christ, James Christ, who some people thought, that's Jack. I got a smile at that one. We don't know. We know it was James. We know this is probably an early Christian text, but it's still very much part of the Jewish community at the same time. So, James, chapter 1. It says, "From James, a slave of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes who are scattered outside the land of Israel, greetings. My brothers and sisters, think of the various tests you encounter as occasions for joy. After all, you know that the testing of your faith produces endurance. Let this endurance complete its work so that you may be fully mature, complete and lacking in nothing. But anyone who needs wisdom should ask God, whose very nature is to give to everyone without a second thought, without keeping score. Wisdom will certainly be given to those who ask. Whoever asks shouldn't hesitate. They should ask in faith without doubting. Whoever doubts is like the surf of the sea, tossed and turned by the wind. People like that should never imagine that they will receive anything from the Lord. They are double-minded, unstable in all their ways. Brothers and sisters who are poor should find satisfaction in their high status. Those who are wealthy should find satisfaction in their low status, because they will die off like wildflowers. The sun rises with its scorching heat, dries up the grass, so that its flowers fall and its beauty is lost. Just like that, in the midst of their daily lives, the wealthy will waste away. Those who stand firm during the testing are blessed. They are tried and true. They will receive the life God has promised to those who love Him as their reward. No one who is tested should say, God is tempting me. This is because God is not tempted by any form of evil, nor does He tempt anyone. Everyone is tempted by their own cravings, and they are lured away and enticed by them. Once those cravings conceive, they give birth to sin, and when sin grows up, it gives birth to death. Don't be misled, my dear brothers and sisters. Every good gift, every perfect gift comes from above. The gifts come down from the Father, the creator of the heavenly lights, in whose character there is no change at all. He chose to give us birth by His true word, and here is the result. We are like the first crop from the harvest of everything He created. Know this, my dear brothers and sisters, everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to grow angry. This is because an angry person doesn't produce God's righteousness. Therefore, with humility, set aside all moral filth and the growth of wickedness, and welcome the word planted deep inside you, the very word that is able to save you. You must be doers of the word, and not only hearers who mislead themselves. Those who hear but don't do the word are like those who look at their faces in the mirror. They look at themselves, walk away, and immediately forget what they are like. But there are those who study the perfect law, the law of freedom, and continue to do it. They don't listen and then forget, but they put it into practice in their lives. They will be blessed in whatever they do. If those who claim devotion to God don't control what they say, they mislead themselves. Their devotion is worthless. True devotion, the kind that is pure and faultless before God the Father, is this: to care for orphans and widows in their difficulties, and to keep the world from contaminating us. Don't show favoritism. My brothers and sisters, when you show favoritism, you deny the faithfulness of our Lord Jesus Christ, who has been resurrected in glory. Imagine two people coming into your meeting. One has a gold ring and fine clothes, and the other is poor, dressed in filthy rags. Then suppose that you were to take special notice of the one wearing fine clothes, saying, "Here is an excellent place, sit here." But to the poor person you say, "Stand over there," or "Sit here at my feet." Wouldn't you have shown favoritism among yourselves and become evil-minded judges? My dear brothers and sisters, listen. Hasn't God chosen those who are poor by worldly standards to be rich in terms of faith? Hasn't God chosen the poor as heirs of the kingdom he has promised to those who love him? But you have dishonored the poor. Don't the wealthy make life difficult for you? Aren't they the ones who drag you into court? Aren't they the ones who insult the good name spoken over you at your baptism? You do well when you really fulfill the royal law found in Scripture. Love your neighbor as yourself. But when you show favoritism, you are committing a sin, and by that same law you are exposed as a lawbreaker. Anyone who tries to keep all the law but fails at one point is guilty of failing to keep all of it. The one who said, "Don't commit adultery," also said, "Don't commit murder." So if you don't commit adultery, but you do commit murder, you are a lawbreaker. In every way, then, speak and act as people who will be judged by the law for you. There will be no mercy in judgment for anyone who hasn't shown mercy. Mercy overrules judgment. My brothers and sisters, what good is it if people say that they have faith, but they do nothing to show it? Claiming to have faith, they can't save anyone, can they? Imagine a brother or sister who is naked and never has enough food to eat. What if one of you said, "Go in peace, stay warm, and have a nice meal"? What good is it if you don't actually give them what their body needs? In the same way, faith is dead when it doesn't result in faithful activity. Someone might claim, "You have faith, and I have action." But how can I see your faith apart from your actions? Instead, I'll show you my faith by putting it into practice faithful action. It's good that you believe that God is one. Even the demons believe this, and they tremble with fear. Are you so slow? Do you need to be shown that faith without actions has no value at all? What about Abraham, our father? Wasn't he shown to be righteous through his actions when he offered his son, Isaac, on the altar? See, his faith was at work along with his actions. In fact, his faith was made complete by his actions. So the scripture was fulfilled that says Abraham believed God, and God regarded him as righteous. What is more, Abraham was called God's friend. You see that a person is shown to be righteous through faithful actions and not through faith alone. In the same way, wasn't Rahab the prostitute shown to be righteous when she received the messengers as her guests and then sent them away by another road? As the lifeless body is dead, so faith without actions is dead. Did you guys follow that? There's a lot to unpack there, and I didn't know where to stop. Everywhere I was like, okay, I'll just read this. And I was like, ooh, that next part's good. I'm going to read that too. Oh, well, I better keep going. Next thing you know, we're just reading all the book of James. But he's talking about faith here. And what's interesting is some of the stuff that he writes about in faith, regarding faith as action, not just as something that we assent to or something like that, is almost being written to, I want to say, counter some of the stuff Paul says about being justified by faith. That faith is through grace and not by works. You guys have heard that? So I want to stop right here and talk about that, right? So we have two parts of our Bible. We have Paul's writings, which really emphasize an aspect of faith that is something that's freely received. And we have James, who emphasizes not necessarily that faith is done by works, but that it is works result from faith. Now, some people want to say that, they're not, like John Calvin wouldn't necessarily say that they were so in disagreement. John Calvin would see that they're kind of talking on the same thing, they're just focusing on different sides of the argument. Okay? Martin Luther, who was the father of our Reformation, thought the book of James was a book of straw. It had no gospel in it, according to Luther. And I'll be honest with you, I'm okay with that. I'm okay that we have somebody in our church tradition that has an issue. And I'm not saying that because that's like, a benefit or whatever. I'm just saying that it's okay that we have a Bible that has multiple strands of people weaving in different thoughts. And those thoughts aren't always going to be on the same page. They're not always going to be in agreement with each other. Is that okay for our Bible to do that? I hope so, because it's the Bible we have. So, yes, that's okay. And I'll kind of get to why I think that's okay as I get into this. But just know that sometimes there's multiple views coming from the Bible on something. They're not all necessarily in the same thought on this. And that's an okay thing, because I think it serves a purpose. I'll get into that. So, I'm going to go back through, and I'm just kind of going to do color commentary on the book of James. So he starts out with, from James, a slave of God and the Lord Jesus Christ. Slave is a pretty heavy word to be throwing around. When you guys think of slave, what do you think of? Huh? Chains. Yes. We think of the slavery that blacks endured for a long time in our country. We think of slave ships. We think of the song Amazing Grace, written by a guy who owned a slave ship and carried slaves from their home to a foreign land. We think of slavery like that.
Powerless.
What's that?
Powerless.
Powerless, yes. Yeah. Now, James wouldn't necessarily be speaking directly to that kind of slavery, although slavery is slavery, right? Let's not church it up. There's no that's a good kind of slavery. Slavery's not ideal, is it? It's not good. It's bad. But it's been practiced in different ways through history, and he's probably referring to here to a Greek or Roman type of slavery, which, while maybe not as obscene and terrible as the slavery that the blacks faced under the slave trade, still bad. But the slaves there had kind of a different function, if you will. And one of those functions I want to highlight, I kind of want to pull out, without necessarily throwing light on the whole thing. But a slave could do functions for the household that the slave worked for. The slave was a member, in one sense, of the household. So much so, the slave could be told to go do things on behalf of the household that they were a slave of. And so when that slave asked for something, it wasn't necessarily the slave's authority. They were using the authority of who? Their master. You're not falling asleep at the wheel, aren't you? That was a very serious point. You just missed it.
Put one of those cages on top.
I should just strap it to my neck and have it going this way. So walk around. So when James is referring to himself as a slave of God, I think it's in regards to that his will and his desires to act on behalf of God. And we can get into more of that if you want. Later you can talk to me about it. I'm not here to make any claim that somehow slavery was okay. I just want to pull out that piece of it, understand maybe where he's coming from when he says that he's a slave of God. So then he writes this to the 12 tribes who are scattered outside the land of Israel. So he's writing to the 12 tribes, which technically by the time this is written didn't exist anymore. And the Jews that were scattered across the land were the diaspora. You guys ever heard of the diaspora? They were Jews that just were foreigners. They're not in their homeland. They had no homeland. They didn't have a place to call home. They were always going to be sojourners in somebody else's land. So this is, metaphorically, he's writing to people that are foreigners in a foreign land, strangers in a strange world. So then he goes on, and he kind of opens his letter about persecution. He says, "My brothers and sisters, think of the various tests you encounter as occasions for joy." Now, I don't know about you, but I do not think of difficulties in my life as occasions for joy. Anybody else? No. I mean, Gina does. I can get so frustrated and bent out of shape by the dumbest of things. Like last night, this is a good example. I didn't really get too bent out of shape, but it was very frustrating. It was kind of later in the evening. I hadn't had dinner, so I was like, I'm going to go to Arby's and I'm going to get some of those mozzarella sticks, because once you get it in your head, you can't get out. You got to have some, right? There's 3 cars in front of me, and I swear these 3 cars had never been through a drive-thru before or read a menu or knew how to drive a vehicle. And they took forever. I could have made my own mozzarella sticks in the time it took them to get through the line. And it was insane. And I was really like, oh, this is like whatever. And then I thought, it's mozzarella sticks. What do I care? Like, maybe this is God telling me I need to get out of the line and walk a little bit. Or not go to get mozzarella sticks. But he's using this as an example. And he's using real persecution, real issues that they're encountering. Because there's a lot of upset during the time that he wrote this. The Jews had, depending on when he wrote it, they were going to either be losing their temple or had already lost their temple. And so they're trying to figure out how they practice their entire faith without having this piece of it that was so central to what they did. So he says, let the endurance complete its work. So our testings, the things we're going through, produce endurance, and endurance completes its work, and it develops in us to be fully mature, complete, and lacking in nothing. And then he goes on to says, but anyone who needs wisdom should ask God, whose very nature is to give to everyone without a second thought, without keeping score. What is wisdom? Every time I read a word, I'm like, I don't really, I think I know what that means, right? And so as I'm going through this, I'm just going to pull out little strands. And it might not be a full thought, but I want you to think about this. But we associate a lot of things with knowledge. Like that we know something, like a fact that we know, right? So people hear wisdom and they think a wise person knows a lot of stuff. I'm going to challenge you that that's not the wisdom, that's not God's wisdom. And we do the same thing with faith, right? Remember how I said earlier? We associated faith with knowledge. That if you know the right things, you have faith, right? So we keep repeating the same mistake. We think that certain things are all about knowledge. And maybe that's something we've inherited from the Enlightenment or something like that. But this is not necessarily what that's directed at. Wisdom does not necessarily equal knowledge. Think of somebody, I'm sure you can, that you've come across in your life who has shown wisdom, but doesn't necessarily know a whole lot about things going on. Can you think of somebody like that? Right? You can think of somebody that's maybe been impactful in your life, and they're what some people would call a simple person. Right? So let's take off the table that wisdom has something to do with knowledge. That if we ask God for wisdom, that we will be able to pass our calculus exam. Or that if we ask God for this, we'll be able to solve all these problems over here. That's not what wisdom is. The Greek usage of the word logos represented wisdom. And wisdom it was like I can't remember it, it's escaped my mind, but in Proverbs and Psalms, it talks about God's wisdom or wisdom, and it personifies it. And that's logos in the Greek, and I can't remember what it is in Hebrew because I'm not a scholar in that way, but the concept is that God has so ordered and designed the world that his wisdom is that ordering and designing of it. It's something that infiltrates everything. It's got a purpose and a direction to what it does. And that you can participate in God's wisdom by being open and understanding to that. Does that make sense? It's kind of ordering nature, if you will. So he says here, if you need wisdom, you should be able to ask God. And it's in God's nature to give wisdom. Now this also is a very dangerous thing. Right? Have everybody heard the joke, don't pray for humility? Because we usually obtain humility by being humiliated. Right? I think wisdom is not necessarily it's a gift that we want, but it's a gift that comes with responsibility. And so he says, whoever asks shouldn't hesitate. They should ask in faith without doubting. Whoever doubts is like the surf of the sea, tossed and turned by the wind. People like that should never imagine that they will receive anything from the Lord. They are double-minded, unstable in all their ways. Anybody here ever been double-minded? Anybody here ever been unstable? I've got more hands on that one. I don't think he's talking about some sort of like existential doubt or whatever. I think what it really comes down to, and what he's talking about, is when you are double-minded, you're having difficulty trusting in something. Has anybody here had difficulty trusting in something? Have you ever had difficulty trusting in yourself? Right? Like, you know that you should do this thing, but you really want to do this thing over here. In one very real sense, you're doubting yourself. You're doubting what you know you should do to go do what you want to do. And I think everybody's hit that wall at some point, right? And then when it kind of goes south, you're like, I knew it. I should have listened to myself. Like, we know when we're messing up, or when we know when we're not going in the right direction for something. I also like how James, if you read this through, it's both encouraging in one sense and also discouraging in another. God can come across as very stick it to you in this book. And I think that's good. I don't think we should completely ignore the justice of God. And that if God is truly good, his justice is good. Even if we have to experience, it's for our good. So then he goes on. Brothers and sisters who are poor should find satisfaction in their high status. Who in here has had a high status? I've been poor. It doesn't feel like a high status when you're going through it. It says those who are wealthy should find satisfaction in their low status, because they will die off like wildflowers. That's some messed up stuff right there. He's turning things on its head. Right? We associate people who are doing well with doing the right things and having obtained that the right way, or there was something special about them. And often we'll see people who don't have those things, or whose life is falling apart, as somehow an example of who they are as a person. And I think as you've sat in this church long enough, you'll learn that Jesus flipped all that stuff upside down. And it's not because, like, okay, you're poor, therefore you all of a sudden are intrinsically, like, there's something extra worthy about you now. It's not that. It's flipping it upside down as in, like, demolishing it. Like, there is nothing about necessarily a poor person that they've done to elevate themselves. It's that, have you guys ever been to the end of your rope financially or whatever, where you just don't know where things are going to come from? What do you have to lose? Right? Not a lot. And when we suffer in that way, sometimes I think that opens up some sort of hearing that we have to hear what God has to say to us. And I think sometimes when we start doing well, or we get like, we're doing all right, we're making lots of money, or everything seems okay, we can become complacent. We can become okay with the status quo. We can think even maybe more dangerously that we deserve those things, or that we earned them, or we finally did the right thing to get all that stuff. And this whole thing is meant to demolish that. Your stuff or lack of stuff isn't what dictates where you stand in God's eyes. But it does show that God has kind of what we'll call a preferential option for the poor. Why does God, revealed in Jesus Christ, show this referential preference for the poor? I think it has to do with power and how we use power. And I think power has a tendency, you've ever heard the phrase, power corrupts. So keep these threads in mind as I'm continuing through this. You guys follow me? We talked about wisdom not being knowledge necessarily. We talked about this high status, wealthy, low status, wildflowers, all this other stuff. And he goes on. He says, no one who is tested should say, God is tempting me. This is because God is not tempted by any form of evil, nor does he tempt anyone. Everyone is tempted by their own cravings. They are lured away and enticed by them. And then he uses what I think is probably some of the best imagery in the Bible. Because he says, once those cravings conceive, like once those cravings are conceived, they give birth to sin, and when sin grows up, it gives birth to death. That's a really interesting picture, because we understand the life process for the most part. We see it all around us. We are in the middle of experiencing it ourselves. And he says that these my translation calls it cravings, are things that maybe the initial craving isn't whatever, but it leads to death. Sometimes it's a small thing, right? Sometimes, I know that we have a lot of people in our church that have dealt with substance abuse or different stuff like that and whatever, and nobody ever just jumps off of right into the deep end, right? It's usually like, just this one time, or because I'm with this person, or I'm just really stressed out right now, or, and it's tiny, it's little, it's whatever. The danger in that is not the thing itself, it's what it leads to. And he goes on, after talking about these cravings that we have that lead us kind of in bad directions. He says, "Don't be misled, my dear brothers and sisters. Every good gift, every perfect gift comes from above. These gifts come down from the Father, the creator of the heavenly lights, in whose character there is no change at all. He chose to give us birth by his true word, and here's the result. We are like the first crop from the harvest of everything he created." He uses agriculture metaphor of the word being something planted that grows and develops. And does anybody here have a garden or do any gardening or whatever? I don't. I took a bonsai one time and I had a whole bunch of bonsai. And I love bonsai. It's so cool, right? You know how patient you have to be to make bonsai work? All of them die. Why? Because I just keep wanting to mess with them and do stuff with them. Like, you have to be able to wait out the process of creating bonsai and forming them and shaping them. And if you go too fast or if you're overzealous, they die. He uses this kind of word that we mentioned before, the word, as something that is like a seed that develops a crop that's eventually harvested. He says, "Know this, my dear brothers and sisters, everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to grow angry." This is because an angry person doesn't produce God's righteousness. Now, I think that we can all understand it's not good to be angry, right? Everybody here has probably experienced at some point in their life somebody who was angry, or you yourself have been angry. I don't know if somebody necessarily would just be hey, justifying that behavior. But I would say that there's still other types of anger that maybe people don't throw into this, right? There's something that can genuinely go wrong that people can be angry about. That I think when they act on it, they might act out of, you guys heard the term righteous indignation. Like, if you're offended on behalf of something that's truly going wrong, that's good. How you act on that, though, can be good or bad. It's not like, well, this is going wrong, and therefore I'm going to go do this thing, and that's somehow justified. Can we act wrongly out of good intentions? Yeah, and we do it all the time. So an angry person doesn't produce God's righteousness. It says, "Therefore, with humility, set aside all moral filth and growth of wickedness, and welcome the word planted deep inside you." Word, logos, wisdom, right? The very word that is able to save you. You must be doers of the word, and not only hearers who mislead themselves. Those who hear but don't do the word are like those who look at their faces in a mirror. They look at themselves, walk away, and immediately forget what they were like. But there are those who study the perfect law, the law of freedom, and continue to do it. They don't listen and then forget, but they put it into practice in their lives. They will be blessed in whatever they do. It would be a weird experience, I think, to go look in a mirror and see yourself and then walk away and immediately not know what you good? Okay. Okay. That's Holly calling to tell me to wrap it up. It's her phone. You guys ever walk into a room to go get something and you forget immediately what it was that you were looking for in the room?
Yes.
No, every day. Right? All the time. Isn't that frustrating? I think we have kind of a spiritual aspect of that, which is that we get fired up for something, or we know we should do something, or we do this, and then immediately we start Monday, and those things are like long gone. It's hard. Developing new habits, understanding ourselves in a new light is very difficult. That word thing that's growing that they keep using is difficult because I don't think any of us are naturally spiritual gardeners. It says, if those who claim devotion to God don't control what they say, they mislead themselves. Their devotion is worthless. True devotion, the kind that is pure and faultless before God, the Father, is this: to care for orphans and widows in their difficulties and to keep the world from contaminating us. So I want to stop here. We talked about true devotion. Is this, to care for orphans and widows in their difficulties. So as Christians, we're talking about faith tonight. We're talking about how we practice our faith. We're gleaning things out about the word or wisdom. We're gleaning things about, they're using like harvest and things that require work or whatever. And we see this here. And if I decided on Monday, from here on out, I'm just going to go help orphans or widows, am I practicing faith? I mean, just if I read it, and I'm being very literal, and the only people I help, I'm like, hey, are you an orphan? No. Are you a widow? No. I need to go find an orphan or a widow to go help. Is that what he's talking about here? He's using a real example in his time. But what does orphan and widow represent? People that are powerless. Exactly. See, I think we get so literal, like we do a lot of functions here at Gather where we help homeless people, right? What do you do? I can't tell if you're getting my attention. No, I'm going to talk to you right now. Okay, you're good? All right. We help like homeless people. And we help people who are displaced. They don't have to just be homeless. Or we help people that are trying to get on their feet or whatever. And it's not that thing that makes us desire to help them. It's that we see that there are people who are living in a powerless way. Right? This is the case where we don't need to be literal with what we're doing here. He's saying widows and orphans because at those times an orphan, somebody who didn't have parents, would be very hard-pressed to get by. And a widow who had lost her husband and couldn't remarry or something like that would be living in basically off the kindness of others. Now today we have people that will take care of orphans, and we have people that will step up and take care of widows, or sometimes women can work now. That has changed in a sense. But do we still have powerless people around us? Maybe if we got more creative with how we understood powerless. Because powerless doesn't necessarily mean that they're poor. It doesn't mean that they don't have family. There's more people I've seen that have been helped here by Gather who have family all over this town, but they don't want anything to do with them. So one way of practicing that faith is understanding power structures, understanding those who are in power and those who are not in power. And that's going to be a key point as I wrap this up, and I'm getting there. Please be patient. You guys doing okay?
Yeah.
Am I going too far down the rabbit hole? Might be.
Can you repeat all that?
I guess you want to start. Okay. Chapter 1. Okay. So, he goes into this thing about those who are powerless. The next step is, my brothers and sisters, when you show favoritism, you deny the faithfulness of our Lord Jesus Christ, who has been resurrected in glory. Imagine two people coming into your meeting. One has a gold ring and fine clothes, while the other is poor and dressed in filthy rags. Then suppose that you were to take special notice of the one wearing fine clothes, saying, "Here's an excellent place, sit here." But to the poor person, say, "Stand over there," or "Here, sit at my feet." Wouldn't you have shown favoritism among yourselves and become evil-minded judges? There's something interesting in the wording here. And I think it does apply to faith and how we practice it. Because what does he say to the person that's dressed well? He says, "Come over here." The language is, "Come over here. Come sit next to me. I want to be with the cool kids." Right? He's showing favoritism, or she's showing favoritism to this person who appears wealthier, appears to have it all put together. And it is, "Come over here. You're on my side. We're on the same side." And to the poor person, when they enter, dressed in shabby clothes, what do they say? "You sit over there." This isn't really about poor people or rich people, is it? What is it about? Us and them. Tracy's dealing every answer tonight. She's doing very well. She's read my notes, and she knows where I'm going with all this. Us versus them. There you study James. Us versus them. We do us versus them all the time. You ever go to a soccer game with kids and get mad at other parents' kids? Like, that kid cheated. And your kid's like over eating grass or something, but you still think they're doing a good job? Right? Like, we get really defensive. There was a fight recently, like a couple months ago, that broke out over like kids' sports stuff. And one guy threatened to murder another guy over kids' sports. And we say, we look at that and we think we're reasonable. We're like, yeah, we would never do that. But we do that in other things in life. Like, we wouldn't necessarily go to a sporting event for kids and threaten somebody's life.
Or waiting at the drive-thru.
But waiting through the drive-thru, that's unrelated. I never threatened to kill anybody.
Just long as they're intelligent.
Yeah. But we do that. We do us versus them. All the time. And as we practice this faith and we try to break down those walls of us versus them, guess what? It's really hard. Shoot, some of the stuff we've done here at Gather, in the helping that we do, I think, oh, it's great that we feed people and that we help clothe people and that we have the cold weather shelter sometimes when they're full down there and we invite them in. I think it's cool that we let them sleep out front of the building if they need to, or under our awning when they can't find housing. Like, I think that's all great, but other people look at that and say, you are signing off, you are co-signing on their bad behavior. And we've gotten heat over that. In the past, we've gotten raked over the coals by other churches. I've looked at how many homeless people that we've had that are sleeping on the streets during like cold winter thing. We have enough churches in this area that we could house most of the town. But we're not, those doors aren't open, and that's not happening. And I understand there's logistics, and I don't want to put down other churches. I'm not saying that at all. I'm just saying that when that happens, I guess what mode I fall back into? Us versus them. And them sometimes is other churches. You want to stick it to them. Is that good? No. No, it's not. Just like yelling at me to do the right thing isn't going to make me necessarily do the right thing. It's just going to make me feel defensive. When I see somebody start picking up trash at the end of an event, and I'm like, I should pick up trash, right? Like, you feel motivated to do the right thing, right? If we keep maybe doing what we're doing, other people will be motivated to do the right thing too. Faith, practicing, all this stuff, very complicated, right? Okay. She says, my dear brothers and sisters, listen, hasn't God chosen those who are poor by worldly standards to be rich in terms of faith? Hasn't God chosen the poor as heirs of the kingdom he has promised to those who love him? But you have dishonored the poor. Don't the wealthy make life difficult for you? I love this line, because I've seen people suck up to people who are more powerful in hopes of getting some of that power or more power, and those people make their lives miserable. I see it in the workplace. You guys have probably been around workers who are terrible people, but then when the boss comes around, who maybe might not necessarily be the greatest person in the world, they're like really sucking up to them, and they'll be just as evil as the boss in hopes that the boss will like them so they can get more power. That's messed up. He says, aren't they the ones who drag you into court? This is about power, that it makes us suck up to people who are openly oppressing us. Isn't that weird? He says, aren't they the ones that insult the good name spoken over you at your baptism? He then switches modes and says, you do well when you really fulfill the royal law found in Scripture. Love your neighbor as yourself. But when you show favoritism, you are committing sin. And by that same law, you are exposed as a lawbreaker. Anyone who tries to keep all the law but fails at one point is guilty of failing to keep all of it. The one who said don't commit adultery also said don't commit murder. So if you don't commit adultery but you do commit murder, you are a lawbreaker in every way. Then speak and act as people who will be judged by the law of freedom, the law of liberty. There will be no mercy in judgment for anyone who hasn't shown mercy. Mercy overrules judgment. He's basically saying it's a zero-sum game when it comes to the law and how we practice it. If we're somehow cheating or winning by technicality, we're not actually really doing what the law commands. And he's talking about the law of freedom, the law of liberty. This isn't some law that's oppressive and holds us down. This is a law that brings all up if we can follow it. He goes on and says, my brothers and sisters, what good is it if people say that they have faith and do nothing to show it? Claiming to have faith can't save anyone, can it? Imagine a brother or sister who is naked and never has enough food to eat. What if one of you said, go in peace, stay warm, have a nice meal? What good is it if you don't actually give them what their body needs? In the same way, faith is dead when it doesn't result in faithful activity. Now this is interesting because we do get this sometimes where we are hopefully feeding people and we are clothing people as much as we can, and we're doing stuff. My wife works at the clothing bank once or twice a week, and we participate in that. And sometimes even in participating in that, you can have people that think it's a bad thing to clothe people. As though like we're helping them continue to live in this terrible life. Right? And the truth of the matter is, whether we clothe them or not, they're still going to be in this terrible life. The clothing isn't necessarily just to keep them warm. It's a relationship that we can hopefully bring them into as part of a family that isn't disjointed or broken or messed up, that will encourage them. Our society has created structures that create these types of things. So some people focus on the actual thing and totally miss the heart behind it, what we're trying to do. So he says, if you have faith, show it. Now we know that there are people that claim to have faith and show it, and that's the only reward they will get. Jesus called them hypocrites. So we have to ask ourselves, like, what is the definition between being a hypocrite or being somebody that does something for show, and it looks great and everybody loves it, and we end up in the paper and all that other stuff, and doing something because that's what God has called us to do as a part of His desire for ourselves and the people that we live around. That gets in pretty sticky territory. So someone might claim you have faith and I have action, but how can you see your faith apart from your actions? Instead, I'll show you my faith by putting it into practice in faithful action. It is good that you believe that God is one. Ha! Even the demons believe this, and they tremble with fear. This is the part where I said, is our faith based off of facts that we know that happened. If something like this over here happened, is that faith? If you believe such and such happened, if we believe Jesus died and rose again, is that faith? Well, he says right here that even demons believe that. Do they have faith? Please, somebody answer that. Do demons have faith? No. No, they don't. So what is that then? Like, what that should tell us, and if we're listening, is that faith isn't based off of just some facts that somebody believes in, or something that the church has told us, or some authority has said this is what you need to believe. Faith is almost on a lower, more primal level than that. It has to do with our will. The center part of us, that word, that logos, that wisdom that grows, is something that bends our will to God's will. That is the whole essence of what I'm trying to get to with faith here. And it has fruit. It produces a crop. That crop is living in a certain way. He goes on in very unkind words to say, are you so slow? Do you need to be shown that faith without actions has no value at all? What about Abraham, our father? Wasn't he shown to be righteous through his actions when he offered his son Isaac on the altar? See, his faith wasn't work along with his actions. In fact, his faith was made complete by his faithful actions. So the scripture was fulfilled. It says Abraham believed God, and God regarded him as righteous. What is more, Abraham was called God's friend. Do you see that a person is shown to be righteous through the faithful actions and not through faith alone? In the same way, wasn't Rahab the prostitute shown to be righteous when she received the messengers as her guests and sent them onward by another road? As the lifeless body is dead, so faith without actions is dead. So, his usage of Abraham here almost counters Paul's usage of Abraham, as Paul was writing about being justified by faith through grace, not of works. So I think there is some sort of what I'll call pushback here. And there's a whole other aspect to this about what it means that Abraham acted in faith. There's a ton to unpack, and we don't have the time, and you guys will be thankful that I don't get into it. But I want to draw out and tease out the cornerstone of this faith here and how that applies to what we're doing. So we know that faith isn't going to church every Saturday evening or Sunday. And we know that it isn't just that we affirm some sort of facts that are out there about Jesus or about the New Testament or about this or that. And we see in our own Bible that we have voices that are discussing matters and they're not necessarily on the same page. And I've told you that I feel that is okay. And here's why. In the very beginning of James, he talks about asking God for wisdom. And I told you that wisdom isn't necessarily about knowledge. We don't get all of a sudden all the answers to all the stuff. Wisdom is a process of weighing a lot of different things in a conversation and making adjustments based off of that information. Wisdom is something that's bought. You ever met somebody who's lived such a crazy life and they're old and super intense and they have this wisdom that's come from all of these decisions that they've had to make in their life? And they've made bad decisions and they've made good decisions and they've used that as they continue to make decisions in their life. That's wisdom. People talk to me, people ask, I guess a Christian question. How's God working in your life? Have you guys heard that? How's God? So everybody's heard that. How's God working through your life? And a good Christian, I used to think, God is doing that. I make something up that I feel like God is working in my life. If you have to make up something, just don't say anything. Just say, I don't know. That's okay. But what I have noticed is I'm not so good about determining what God's doing necessarily right now, and I'm not so good at determining what God's going to do in the future, but I can look back on my life and I can see where God has done something. And I use that as, I'll use a fancy word here, a heuristic, as a learning tool for maybe to see how God's working right now. Does that make sense? You've heard hindsight is 20/20. I don't think it's that clear. But I will say that if we can look back and see how we've made decisions, see what's motivated us, see what maybe where God was trying to knock into our skulls, don't do this or whatever, we can use that going forward. And that is wisdom. And wisdom is practicing that faith. Wisdom is trust. Trust that the God that's revealed in Jesus Christ, the God that Jesus loved, and the God that Jesus died for is true. that he is everything that Jesus thought he was. That is faith. It's trust. It's I mentioned this with my kids at dinner. It's a posture, right? And my kids were like, well, what's a posture, right? I said, have you ever come across a cat who's like maybe his ears are back and his hackles are all raised and it's making a noise? Yeah, the tail's doing the little thing. You know something's going to die when the tail starts moving. It's usually like a foot that's not wearing any shoe or sock on it or something, right? We can tell by that cat's posture what's going to happen next if we're paying attention. Faith is a posture toward God's will, toward God's wisdom. And it doesn't mean that we have all the answers. It doesn't mean that we know everything that's going on or we'll be able to tell other people what to do in their life, because it's very have to do with in-the-moment type stuff. Faith is a posture toward God in trust that says that even if I can't see how all this stuff works out, or even if things aren't going well for me, I trust in the goodness of God. That's faith. That's the faith that Jesus practiced in Gethsemane, right? We open communion with on the night he was betrayed. And we always talk about the Last Supper, but the important aspect of on the night he was betrayed is what happened right before he was betrayed. Right? Where was Jesus? He was in the garden. What was he doing? He was praying fervently. How was he feeling? He was feeling scared. He was fearful. He was stressed. Okay? They said that he prayed so hard and so fervently that what happened to his face? He sweat and blood. It's an actual medical condition that happens when people are in intense, stressful situations. The capillaries on the skin burst open and it looks like you're sweating blood. Has anybody in here ever experienced stress so intense that you have sweat blood? I'm going to say no. Okay? But that is faith. I know that sounds weird. Christian faith has a very strong component in understanding suffering and the cross. Okay? Faith is trust despite what things appear. Faith is trust that God is really good and that he'll take care of it no matter how it ends up. Whether we're going to our death knowingly on a cross, or whether we're facing cancer, or whether we're facing the loss of a family member, it's hard and it's not easy, but wisdom produces a faith that says that God is really good despite appearances sometimes of what we're going through. Does that make sense? It's a posture. And if we see wisdom as God's working through this world a certain way, it's almost like our faith is the sail that catches the wind that guides and directs them. Does that make sense? So I wanted to give 2 examples I could think of off the top of my head of people that have impacted this faith. We know what it means when people have faith and they maybe misuse it. We've seen that before. Have you guys ever heard of spiritual abuse? It's a type of abuse that has to do with, well, spiritual things. It's where people have maybe been in a church that's really controlling, authoritative, or a church that has maybe abused you in a way, not physically necessarily, but emotionally, or whatever. You guys maybe been in a relationship. They talk about abusive relationships, and we think somebody hitting somebody else. But there's so much more to abusive relationships than being beaten, isn't there? You can be in an abusive relationship and never be touched by the other person. There's a type of abuse that can happen that has to do with how they treat you and how they whatever. And spiritual abuse, that happens. Some people utilize their faith toward power. And as I hope I've drawn out for you here, is our faith toward power? No. God, that's God's thing. We let God take care of that. And we have to be careful when we marry our faith and we marry what we understand of faith to certain things of power. Okay? Because the Germans during World War II had the, God with us slogan as they marched in to kill Jews. Okay? We have the Crusades. We have tons of examples of Christians using their faith toward power to oppress. And I don't think you get that when you get the us versus them type mentality. I'm certain that's not the right practice of faith. Does that make sense? So it's a dangerous thing, that whole responsibility part of it. So the first person I want to talk about is Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Everybody here heard of Dietrich Bonhoeffer? So he lived during the time of the Second World War. He was a theologian, and he taught at seminaries. And as the Nazis rose to power, he opposed them in various different ways. He had a pretty cushy life. He was born into a family that was well-to-do. They were okay. And they kind of thought it was weird that he picked up theology of all things to go be, but it was his passion. And as he got further into it, and as the Nazis came into power, he opposed them. And what happens when you oppose power? What can happen to you? Yeah, you can experience extreme difficulty or death. And he did. He got imprisoned. And then right as the war was wrapping up, right as the regime was falling, they dispatched orders to have him hung. And he was killed as Nazis were fleeing. Which is just kind of a stick it to you sort of thing. But that's a type of faith that's practicing God's will for understanding the oppressed and God's will for us bringing his kingdom here. That's a type of faith that plays out in a way very different than the type of faith that plays out in power and control and authority. So before Dietrich Bonhoeffer met his end, he had fled Germany on a ship and came to the U.S. where they had wanted him to come over. They said, hey, you're in danger. You need to come over here. And he writes to a friend of his, Reinhold Niebuhr, if you guys are Niebuhrians. He says, I've come to the conclusion that I made a mistake in coming to America. I must live through this difficult period in our national history with the people of Germany. I will have no right to participate in the reconstruction of Christian life in Germany after the war if I do not share the trials of this time with my people. Christians in Germany will have to face the terrible alternative of either willing the defeat of their nation in order that Christian civilization may survive, or willing the victory of their nation and thereby destroying civilization. I know which of these alternatives I must choose, but I cannot make that choice from security. It says he returned to Germany on the last scheduled steamer to cross the Atlantic. That is a faith that is practicing the will of God. That is a posture toward what God has called us to do. I have two quotes from him. He says, action springs not from thought, but from a readiness for responsibility. And only he who believes is obedient, and only he who is obedient believes. Obedience is the organ of spirituality. It's that muscle that we exercise. The other person I want to talk about is Albert Schweitzer. Similar story, but Albert Schweitzer, how many people have heard of Albert Schweitzer? I don't know if, okay, good. He's not so well known, I think, by my generation and younger, but he has an amazing story, and he's one of my favorite Christian people. I'll say that. He was born in 1875 to a family that was heavily dedicated and steeped in music and religion and education. His father and grandfather were both ministers. He was educated at the University of Strasbourg, eventually obtaining a doctorate in philosophy, and he went on to hold administrative positions in the Theological College of St. Thomas. And he published a book that is actually still pretty important today called The Quest of the Historical Jesus. And he was known internationally not just for this book. So in theological circles, you'll know of Albert Schweitzer. But he was also known internationally as a concert organist. He loved playing the organ. He could rebuild organs. And he loved, like, Johann Sebastian Bach and stuff like that. He was a very accomplished musician. He decided to be a medical missionary, so he went to medical school. So we got a guy that's a great musician, who's also a philosopher, a theologian, and now a medical missionary. And he would eventually establish a hospital in Lambaréné. I don't know how to pronounce that in French, but it's in the French Equatorial Africa. So you have a guy who has all the great things that you could have. He had teaching positions. He had money. He had a book that was really popular at the time. He had all of this stuff. He had fame. And what he ended up opting to do for the last half of his life with his wife was to go become a medical missionary and start a hospital in Africa. And I think I read that he had started something like 80 different buildings in this hospital. He built them and administered them and took care of them. He left kind of a cushy life, and he used that money that he made from that cushy life and those good things. And that's good. I'm not saying that's bad. I'm just saying that he felt like this is what he was called to do, and he went off and he did it. And he died in Africa doing what he felt like he was called to do. I have had correspondence with an early church historian, Dale Allison. He's a historian I really appreciate, and I've read a lot of his books. And he had made a comment in passing that Schweitzer was like the closest thing that Protestants have to a saint. And I believe it. I believe that Albert Schweitzer followed a call of faithfulness that led him there. It says that Lamborghini Schweitzer was a doctor and a surgeon in the hospital, pastor of a congregation, administrator of a village, superintendent of buildings and grounds, writer of scholarly books, commentator on contemporary history, musician, host to countless visitors. And the quote that I picked out for him was, "Think occasionally of the suffering of which you spare yourself the sight." That's also a faithful thing to do, is to make sure that we're looking at the areas of suffering that we have previously been avoiding recognizing. It says, just as the wave cannot exist for itself, but is ever a part of the heaving surface of the ocean, so must I never live my life for itself, but always in the experience which is going on around me. So we practice our faith here and now. And I'm going to close with 2 quotes from John Calvin. And I want to throw one thing out there as I'm closing. Faith doesn't mean that you have to go to Germany and get yourself killed. It doesn't mean that you have to go to Africa and suffer all of the things that Albert Schweitzer suffered in Africa and die there. That is not, that's a caricature of faith. That's what those people were called to do. Okay? You all have lives here, and you all have different things that God has called you to do. And that might be to stand up and risk your life. But it also might mean that you're a father who stays at a job that maybe is frustrating because you want your family to have stability and comfort. Maybe you're a mother who has other plans and wants to do other things, but you put those on the back burner for other purposes, for other people, maybe for your kids, or maybe to take care of a family member or something like that. That is the same type of faith. Do you guys get that? That God calls you where you are, and He doesn't necessarily call you to send you to Africa. He calls you to practice your faith here and now. It's not always a life or death, but if it's to be called of you, God expects that you can rise up and do that, and He will make that okay. I don't know how to explain that any better. Sometimes faith is having hit the worst that you've ever hit and coming back up and realizing there are people who have experienced what you've experienced, and you are with them while they're at the worst that they're hitting. Maybe your faith is called just to suffer with other people. Right? Maybe your faith is calling you to take care of little kids so adults can concentrate on what they're doing and also to teach the kids. Maybe your faith is calling you. Do you guys get it? There's a lot of stuff. It doesn't have to be the most intense thing. It could, from the outside appearances, it could look like the most boring thing in the world. Maybe being just a constant figure in somebody's life that they can always call on and depend on and be there to tell you the worst things that they've done and you love them. Maybe that's what you're called to do. You know? Does that make sense? John Calvin writes that faith is sure and steadfast knowledge of the fatherly goodwill of God toward us. It's trust, isn't it? He goes on to say, his faith does not rest on ignorance, but on knowledge. Knowledge not simply of God, but of God's will. We attain salvation not because we are ready to embrace as truth whatever the church has prescribed, or because we delegate to the church the duty of inquiring and learning, but rather when we recognize that God is a Father who is well disposed to us, and that Christ has been given to us as our righteousness, sanctification, and life. It is by this knowledge, I say, not by surrendering our minds, that we obtain access to the kingdom of God. So when Psalms 80, verse 3 says, "Let your face shine, that we may be saved," what it's calling us on God is, God, let me see you. Let me see you and how you want me to work. And that seeing of God might come with an imperative that God gives us. It might be dangerous. It might be risky. It might be scary. It might be the end of comfort. But those things that we give up for God, we need to trust that God is good. He'll take care of us no matter what happens. I think it was Nate Satan said, "He is no fool who gives up what he cannot keep to receive that which he cannot lose." You can't lose God's loving kindness toward us, can we? So, sorry if that was long, sorry if that was confusing and rambling, but I hope you guys can maybe use some of these threads of how we practice our faith to go on and practice your faith. So, we'll start wrapping things up here. I am going to pray. All right, let's pray. God, we thank you that you are a gracious God, that you are a good God, that you are a good judge, and that you call us. You call us to step into this faith that doesn't necessarily give us answers, or it isn't going to put us in a place of power. We trust, God, that you are in control, that you are good. And we thank you for those people that have come before us, that have practiced their faith in amazing ways and simple ways, whether that is going back into Nazi Germany, knowing that they may die, or going to Africa to help those who can be oppressed or need help. Or whether it's something simple, like just being a good father, or being a good mother, or being a good grandparent, or being available to a friend, or just aware of the situation of people around us, being a good neighbor, caring for people, loving people. God, help us as we step into your will to relax and let your will carry us where we need to go. Help us to see openings and see things that only the eye of faith can reveal about what you've called us to do in life. God, we thank you that you care for us and that we can trust you and that you are a good God. We pray as we go out here tonight and as we go home and as we go to work, that we can continue to practice that posture toward you being a good and loving God, and that you have good desires and intention for us and for the people that we come into contact with. Our faith isn't some stagnant thing, or it's not just some fact or knowledge that we just know, or it's a place that we show up to, but the faith is a real living posture, a real openness to the will, to your wisdom, God. And I pray that we could follow in that we can step into that we can let you guide and direct us. We thank you, God, for your love and your kindness. Amen. Wrap it up for kids. His work on the cross. We thank you that you, God, take things like the garden in Gethsemane and you turn them into something beautiful, like the resurrection. And we pray, Father, that you be with us in our times of garden of Gethsemane and that you be with us in our times of resurrection. We thank you for your grace and your mercy. Just be with us as we leave here. In Jesus' name. Amen. Have a good evening, everybody.